Welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Assembly Call Radio, where each week we discuss the most important IU basketball stories from the past 7 days. This is episode number 40 of Assembly Call Radio, so obviously we dedicate it to Calvert Chaney, Cody Zeller, and yes, T. John Job. And it is our 332nd episode overall of the Assembly Call, recorded on the evening of Thursday, August 17th, 2017. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Remember, if you can't catch one of our shows live, you can always catch up with our podcast, which is available everywhere. Just search for Assembly Call wherever you listen to podcasts, and you will find us. All right, let's begin how we begin every show, and that is with our Hoosier Proud banner moment. And my Hoosier Proud banner moment for this week is Marvin Bagley committing to Duke. Huh? All right, hear me out. Because adding the number one prospect in the country will make Indiana's upset of the freshman-laden Blue Devils all the more sweet and unexpected. I know. Duke is absolutely loaded with talent this year. They already have a potential first-team All-American senior in Grayson Allen, and now they have 4 5-star freshmen surrounding him, plus one-time IU recruit Jordan Tucker. The Blue Devils are loaded. But you know who else was loaded? The 2012 Kentucky Wildcats, the number one overall team in KenPom, the eventual national champions. A historically raucous Assembly Hall got to them, and a very good Indiana team beat them. You know who else was loaded? Last year's North Carolina Tar Heels, the number 3 team in KenPom, the eventual national champions. A historically raucous Assembly Hall got to them, and an Indiana team that at the time was playing like a very good team beat them. So how good will Duke be in 2017? I don't know. Probably top 5 in KenPom. They might even win the national title. They have the talent. They have the coaching. But you know what they won't have? A win at Simon Skjodt Assembly Hall on their resume, because you know the Hall will be at historically raucous levels for Archie Miller's first big home game, and teams full of freshmen do not come into Simon Skjodt Assembly Hall and get wins. They get overwhelmed by one of college basketball's most intimidating venues, and that's exactly what will happen on November 29th. Mark this down. That night will be one of Robert Johnson's signature performances as a Hoosier, and Archie Miller will get his first signature win at IU. And on that night, we will all feel that Indiana is one giant step closer to hanging banner number 6. Surely not this season, but in an Archie Miller-led season to come. And that is what the banner moment is all about. All right, well, that was this week's banner moment, brought to you, as always, by our friends at HoosierProud.com. And now, let me introduce my esteemed co-host for this evening. Zach McCrite is away coaching volleyball, and Ryan Phillips couldn't make it. He didn't leave a reason, so we're just going to assume something really, really, really important on the San Diego high school sports scene is happening tonight, or he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, because it usually takes him a good 90 minutes to pry himself away when that happens. But enough about who isn't here. Let's celebrate who is here, because while he's not the loudest or the brashest or the most annoyingly optimistic of our team, he is the guy who 9 out of 10 Assembly Call listeners say is the smartest among us, and who 10 out of 10 would trust if their lives depended on predicting the teams and seeds for an NCAA tournament bracket. He's the president of the Robert Johnson fan club. He's a husband. He's a father. And much to his own chagrin, he's a Reds fan. He is Andy Bottoms. Andy, what is your Bottoms line from the past week in IU basketball?
Well, my Cincinnati fandom took another hit on Tuesday night. We went to the FC Cincinnati game against the New York Red Bulls, and they had a 2-0 lead with a chance to go to the finals of the U.S. Open Cup and ended up losing 3-2. So that was a vintage Cincinnati level performance. But enough about that. That's coming too close to Ryan's territory of talking about something completely unrelated to what we were going to talk about on the show. So, for me, it was really the schedule, and we're going to get into this a lot more. But the big takeaway for me was the fact that, the much maligned decision of the Big Ten to put the Big Ten tournament a week early in Madison Square Garden, and the domino effect that had on the schedule as a whole. You see non-conference games being jammed in to try to play enough of those before the conference season that you've got 2 stretches of 3 games in 6 days during the non-conference portion of the schedule. And then you get into the conference part of the schedule, and you have similar short turnarounds where you've got a Saturday and then a Monday game. And a Monday and a Wednesday game. You've got all these things, and that's all because of the Big Ten's decision that we have all criticized and hated. And now I think, we understood there were scheduling implications, but seeing the schedule, you see how much that impacts things, not just for IU, but certainly for other schools as well. This move to having games on virtually every day of every week. So you've got Friday games, you've got Monday games, and how they're kind of jamming all these together. While it will certainly make for an interesting time for us hosting the post-game show, it's also going to be really taxing, I think, on the teams. And again, not just IU, some certainly more than others, as we'll get into, later in the show. But, that just was one thing that just stuck out to me, so clearly when the schedule was released. And I think, in a lot of ways, IU didn't get a great draw, or however you want to say it. Again, other teams had similar, may have similar issues, but that was the one thing to me that, it wasn't enough to have one dumb decision to do that. It's all the other things that ended up happening as a result.
No question. And we talk about what's on tap this week. As you mentioned, the schedule is out, so there's a lot to discuss there, and we're going to spend a lot of time breaking down the schedule on this week's episode. Also, from last week, we didn't get a chance to cover this, but Archie Miller had some really interesting comments in a Bloom magazine article, and so we want to talk about those as well. Obviously, Twitter Q&A. We will get to that at the end. And I see some people in the live chat already playing Assembly Call Bingo. Of course, you can go to assemblycall.com/bingo, get your bingo cards. And by the way, that's not just for the people who listen live Thursday night. If you're listening on the radio Friday evening or Saturday morning, you can play too. Just if you get a bingo, let us know. Send it in, pretty soon after the show. And of course, we're playing for a free shirt at HoosierProud.com. So we're going to break down the schedule here in just a second, and then everything else that I talked about coming on this week's edition. But real quick, you've been hearing us talk about SeatGeek on the show for a while now because they've been a loyal supporter of the Assembly Call, and we're loyal users of their service. So it's really a great fit. So I just want to remind you to use the promo code ASSEMBLY, ASSEMBLY, when you create your SeatGeek account and make your first purchase so that you can get $20 back after that purchase. Now, why should you use SeatGeek? Well, because in our opinion, it's the best place to shop for all kinds of tickets, sporting events, concerts, live shows. And specifically, it's a great place to shop for IU basketball and football tickets. For example, there are still tickets available at good prices, $87 at last check, actually, for Indiana's opener against Ohio State, where, if you haven't heard, ESPN's College Game Day is going to be setting up shop. My guess is those tickets will be gobbled up as we get closer to game day, so act now if you're interested in going. Besides, we need to make sure that it's IU fans who are getting those tickets, not visiting Buckeyes. To find the best price on tickets to this game and the rest of the IU football schedule, visit the URL iufbtickets.shop, not .com, .shop. That's iufbtickets.shop. And by the way, that's our affiliate URL, meaning that when you use it to browse tickets at SeatGeek, we get a commission whenever a purchase is made. In other words, you get a great deal on IU tickets, and you help support the Assembly Call at the same time. A true win-win. iufbtickets.com. All righty, you are listening to the Assembly Call. I am Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms talking IU basketball, and we're talking about the schedule. That's the big story this week. I mean, first observation, how nice is it to have the schedule out early? It feels like, it has felt like every year we've been waiting and waiting for the schedule, and it's kind of ironic that now with the new coach, you would think it might even take a little bit longer to get the complete schedule, but we got it all. The Big Ten portion of the schedule, the non-conference games, Hoosier Hysteria scheduled. Everything is there. So a few quick observations, Andy, and then I want to get yours. But, as you mentioned, number one, the schedule is just nuts. I mean, there are quick turnarounds. There's games on every day of the week, which is new, and we're going to get into that a little bit. I don't think the Big Ten did Indiana any favors, and we're going to get to this in our second segment. And maybe the biggest takeaway is that the non-conference schedule is so much better, and it's exactly what we've been asking for. So let's make sure that we're patient with a new coach, in a new school and new players trying to get acclimated to a new system, because Indiana will face three, and these are all rankings from last year, 3 top 50 teams, one team that was a top 100, that's Seton Hall, 4 teams that were between 101 and 200, 3 between 200 and 300, and then only 1 sub-300 team. And in one early analysis that I saw, it rated Indiana as having the toughest non-conference schedule in the Big Ten. Now, we'll have to wait and see some of the teams that are in holiday tournaments, who do they end up playing. But that right there, just being in the conversation for toughest non-conference schedule in the Big Ten a year after having one of the worst in the country, it just shows us that we're on the right track for this program being where we want to be in terms of who we're playing in the non-conference. So I really think that the schedule, there's some things to pick apart, and we will get to that. But my big observation is the schedule is going to make this season really, really interesting, perhaps maddeningly so in some ways, and maybe unnecessarily challenging to Indiana in some ways because of, some of those one-day turnarounds. But it certainly is going to be interesting, and that's much more than we can say about some of the schedules that we've had recently.
Yeah, I mean, you just think, I mean, they're cramming 30 games in by, I think the Ohio State game that closes out the season is on February 23rd. So inherently, you just have a lot of a lot of games in a relatively short period of time. I mean, that starts right out of the chute. There's 3 games in 6 days to start the season, 3 days off, and then 3 games in 6 days again. So I think that'll, we're going to learn a lot about this team very early on. And I think while we'll certainly expect room for growth, I mean, you've got the stretch, 5-game stretch that features games, the Duke game at home that apparently we can chalk up as a win based on what you said earlier. So that's good.
That's right.
So on the heels of that exciting victory, they go to Michigan, then they host Iowa in the second of their, 2 early season Big Ten games, then go to Louisville and then play Notre Dame in Indianapolis in the Crossroads Classic. So I mean, that's 5 really tough games in succession. Kind of put them through the meat grinder and see see how they look. And then, the Big Ten schedule, I'll kind of save thoughts on that. Just to kind of underscore a little bit of what you said about the non-conference. I looked back basically last 4 years of KenPom and last 4 years of RPI for the teams that are there. On average, Howard is the only one that's a real, stinker, I guess you would say, from the MEAC, where they've averaged outside of the top 300 in both those metrics. But, in the others, there's a lot of teams consistently between 100 and 200, hardly anybody that averages outside of the 250 range in either of those. So again, with somewhat a limited ability to schedule who exactly they would like, because of the short turnaround from the new coaching staff, I think they did a good job of putting together, a relatively tough schedule. Other thing I noticed is in the non-conference, outside of playing 3 teams from the ACC, they don't play more than 1 team from any other league, and I think that's interesting to kind of diversify that. I know, a couple of years ago, I joked that we were the champions of, I think it was the Southland or the SWAC or one of those, where they just loaded up and played 3 or 4 teams. I think last year was the Ohio Valley, and in that case, odds are a couple of the leagues that these teams come from are going to be good and can help IU, because the RPI kind of bases who you beat and who, those teams beat, as opposed to, putting a lot of your eggs in the basket of a really poor league. So for the most part, of leagues that that consistently finish toward the bottom of these rankings, IU stayed away from those leagues with the exception of that Howard game. So I think they did a pretty good job on short notice putting things together and looking through some of the returnees on some of these teams. I think there's, some of them should prove to be a pretty good challenge. And as we already said, we've got those 4 kind of marquee games already in there that are going to be really big. And I think, from a top 4 game standpoint, or 4 toughest non-conference games, I don't know that there'll be a lot of teams that would stack up to what IU is going to face. Now it's just left to see how they do when they play against it.
Yeah, and let's be clear about this. Indiana was going to be playing Seton Hall and Duke and Notre Dame and Louisville, even if Tom Crean was still the coach. I mean, those games, the Louisville game was already set. The other games are part of, classics tournaments. So those were already going to be set. If you want to know what's really different about this year's schedule as opposed to past years, look at Thanksgiving, all right? Because the day before Thanksgiving, Indiana plays Arkansas State. The day after Thanksgiving, Indiana plays Eastern Michigan. So, number one, that right there is kind of interesting, those 2 games sandwiching Thanksgiving. But you have Arkansas State last year that was 124th in KenPom, and Eastern Michigan that was 148th. These are the kind of teams that Indiana wasn't playing and the kind of teams that we were clamoring to see them play. Fewer of these just cupcakes where it's a 40-point victory and you don't learn anything about your team. Bring some teams into Assembly Hall that if you're not on your A game, you may go down to the wire, or you could even get beaten, because you're going to find out more about your team in those games. Not to mention, it helps you when it comes to your strength of schedule and for your seeding. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how good those teams are. Arkansas State, they had a couple of important seniors last year, but they have 4 seniors back. So that's clearly an experienced program. And so they will be challenging. Eastern Michigan lost 2 key seniors. So I wonder if they'll be as good as they were last year. But still, those are the kind of teams that I think we all want to see Indiana play more, and it's nice to see that. And that, to me, is the big difference in terms of flavor for this non-conference schedule.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think both those teams can be good, and both come from leagues that have been relatively successful in recent years. I think that's, the league affiliation is really a big deal. I mean, the odds of, not every MAC team is good. So to kind of use the Eastern Michigan example, not every MAC team is great, but that league is pretty consistently ranked, at least in the middle of the pack from an RPI and a KenPom standpoint. So unless you get the worst, unless you just so happen to get the worst of the worst that league has to offer, you're going to be facing a team that doesn't have a terrible RPI and actually will give you, some flavor of a challenge as you're going through. So I think that's interesting. I think playing Fort Wayne again is interesting. I think I saw somebody allude to that being moved up, and that may help a little bit of scheduling the Arkansas series. But that's a good team that
Arizona series.
Yeah, sorry. IU knows all too well how good that team is, and they've got 3 of their top 4 scorers back. So a couple other veteran guys there in the mix as well. So I think they'll be good. Even the Tennessee Tech game, in Ohio Valley School, they may end up being one of the better teams in that league. They've got 4 of their top 5 scorers back. So I think some interesting challenges, certainly winnable games that you would chalk up as victories, but I don't think, the same kind of, cakewalks that you would see. And I think that's good for, the new coaching staff to really test the players early and see what they have. But I think it's also good for the fans where you might actually be able to make some judgment about how the team is going to be. Because there were so many times in the last couple of years that we've gotten on the postgame show after these and just kind of stare at each other trying to figure out what to talk about because you didn't learn anything. You saw some red flags and you could kind of chalk them up to, well, maybe it's just because of the level of competition. We don't know. And in a lot of cases, those red flags proved to be accurate because the defense was terrible. But some of those kinds of things I think were really hard to get a read on. So, I think from a fan's perspective, it's exciting because I think they will give us a better idea as they go and some kind of baseline to really evaluate them as they improve. We would expect over the course of the season as they get more familiar, with Archie's style, as guys settle into roles a little bit better into the Big Ten season. So I think a lot of positives, minus the, short turnarounds and some of those kinds of things that we've lamented already. I think a lot of different chances to learn about the team. And I think that's what most fans really want at that part of the year.
No question. All right, coming up on the assembly call, we are going to dive into the Big Ten portion of the schedule. By the way, have you seen what the first 6 road games are for Archie Miller as Indiana's head coach? Whoa, are they tough? We'll talk about those coming up. All right, 17 minutes and 1 second for that first segment. That was one of our longer first segments.
Yeah, I think so. But at least kind of got all the non-conference and general stuff out of the way, so then we can use this whole one for the Big Ten piece. So
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, let me pull my and get my time thing up here. Oh, it doesn't work anymore. The little thing that I had that added up the time. That's weird. Anyway, we'll figure that out. All right, nice to see everybody here live. There was a question on here, and I believe Brian made an executive judgment that I agree with. Someone needed to change their bingo card because Ryan's not here. So yes, within the first 10 minutes, changing is allowed. I'm down with that. Andy, you have any problem with that? When the first 10 minutes of the show, you can change your card?
No, that seems fair because we don't always say who's going to be on when. So if you want to try to load up on things that are non-Ryan specific, although some of them, like, taking shots at him are certainly still fair game, whether he's here or not. Actually, especially
that's already happened, actually.
So, well, that's already happened multiple times, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. Yes. The other thing I was thinking too, the bonus of watching live is you have more time to fill your bingo card because if you're only listening to the podcast, you don't get the stuff in the middle.
True.
So that is a definite bonus. Okay, so let's dive into the Big Ten part of the schedule. I'll lead off with the road game thing since I teased that, and then let's jump in. What do you think is the most interesting angle to start with?
The road game piece I think will be somewhat interesting because last year we got having all those home games before the students were back. We might benefit from that this year, going to Wisconsin and to Minnesota early on. So that's a potential, but I can kind of jump in on that as you talk about those.
Yeah, let's do that, and then let's talk about the one-day turnarounds where Indiana,
a couple of the
killed.
Yeah, well, even a couple of the stretches where there's I think my favorite was the at Michigan State Friday, Maryland Monday, at Illinois on Wednesday. That was a good one. And I think the other thing overall is that the start is really challenging, but I think there's a chance to build some momentum toward the end. So we can kind of hit on that at some point while we go through it. But
Agreed.
Yeah, whatever other thoughts you have, I think we can go a lot of different directions. So
okay,
just keep us honest on time so we don't end up having 15 minutes left for the last 2 segments.
Well, if we do, that's okay. Schedule is the most important thing.
Or if this even bleeds into the third one, that's fine too.
Exactly. Okay.
Either way,
let's do it. Ready?
Yep.
Okay. You are listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris, talking IU basketball with my co-host on the Assembly Call IU postgame show, Andy Bottoms. So, Andy, have you? I'm sure you have. Have you seen the first 6 road games that Archie Miller will face as Indiana's head coach? You want me to list these out for you?
Yeah, please do. I want to not be able to sleep well tonight, so that seems like a good idea.
Yeah, then you go hide under a bed or get in a closet or something. Here we go. All right, at Seton Hall, at Michigan, at Louisville, at Wisconsin, at Minnesota, at Michigan State. Those are Archie Miller's first 6 road games.
Oh yeah, no big deal. Those are all easy places to win, and against teams that are not good at all. So that should be no issue at all.
Okay, off the top of your head, which is the easiest one of those to win? Do you think? Like, which one do you think Indiana is most likely to win of those 6?
Oh my gosh. There's so many, like, not to give people bingos away. There's so many like horror stories at virtually all of these venues. So you really can't. I'm gonna go against the grain and maybe say at Wisconsin.
That's the one I'm thinking too. I know
students won't be there. Their roster is really the most in flux of any of those teams, and might catch them early before they kind of have things figured out, which is insane to say based on our history.
This is going to come back to haunt us, but it's not. But it's a new coach. It's a new program, so. But okay, so you were mentioning something in the break, though, where obviously Indiana got screwed last year because we had those early home games, the Nebraska game. I think Wisconsin was one of those too, where there was just no students, no life. It was over Christmas break. Indiana may benefit from that this year. Yeah,
I mean, those I guess not the first year. I keep forgetting about that Michigan game, although I guess who knows when, depending on when those are, I assume classes would still be in session there. But the Wisconsin and Minnesota ones at the beginning of January, maybe cases where students aren't back. So that would potentially help a little bit. I mean, it's certainly a really tough start to the Big Ten schedule in general when you look at those 2 games in December, plus, the first 2 being at Wisconsin and then at Minnesota, who's supposed to be one of the better teams in the league. So those will be challenging for sure, but potentially could benefit from not having the students there.
All right, so let's talk about the Big Ten schedule because there are so many angles. It's just, and people may say, okay, why are you making such a big deal about the schedule? Well, there's a lot that's different about this schedule, as you mentioned, because of playing the Big Ten tournament at Madison Square Garden, these 2 early games. I mean, it's crazy, not to mention that because of the deal with Fox, now there are going to be Big Ten basketball games literally every night of the week. And so Indiana will be playing Monday games. They'll be playing Friday games. Here's an interesting note, Andy. Of all the days of the week, the only day of the week that Indiana only plays 1 game, it's Thursday. So clearly the schedule makers were respecting the sanctity of Thursday night live assembly call recordings because they didn't want to have an actual game interfere with it. So I just like to thank them for that. Yeah.
That was one of the only things we can thank them for. But we'll thank them for that. Now,
when we have the Wednesday, Friday night games and then a radio show sandwiched in between, we'll never see our wives. But that's we'll figure that out. Okay, but here's probably the biggest storyline to me looking at this. All right, and we've got to talk about the sets of the 2 early games because there's a couple of teams that really made out nicely. So we're going to get to that in a second. But the big change is there's a lot of one-day turnarounds. And when you have to squeeze a lot of games into a small period of time, that's just going to happen. Some teams are going to have to play a game. They've got a day break and then play another game. Well, 2 teams have 4 sets of those during Big Ten play, Indiana and Minnesota. So Indiana has Michigan, Iowa. Then there's another one with Maryland, Illinois, and then Purdue, Ohio State, and then Michigan State, Rutgers. And those last 3 are actually in succession. At the end of January and the 1st of February. Several other teams have 3. A couple of teams only have 2, or a few teams actually, like Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, Penn State. They only have 2. And Purdue and Wisconsin only have 1 of those one-day turnarounds, which as you go through a tough, brutal, grinded out Big Ten schedule, that seems like it would be an advantage. So that, for ways that the schedule may advantage Indiana, and I think, having the way that the road games kind of play out there during Christmas break, that may be an advantage. We'll get to the end of the schedule, which kind of opens up for Indiana if they can just stay alive through early February. But that part in January and early February, the first week in February, is pretty brutal. And it's really going to test the mettle of a team that one of the big question marks is depth, especially behind a couple of guys who, have been a little bit injury prone and or had conditioning issues that have kept them off the floor.
Yeah, and now the optimist in me would say this is the perfect preparation for the NCAA tournament because that's what you're doing. You don't have these long turnarounds. So I guess if you want to frame it up in some way, that's certainly one way that you could look at it. But yeah, I mean, all the IU ones are, you're home for one game and road for the other, or vice versa. So you've also got travel built in there, where at least you would think that if you're going to have games like that, at least then maybe you wouldn't have to travel as you do that. But that's not the case. And even one of those you mentioned, there's a Maryland, Illinois. There's actually a Friday they play at Michigan State, then come home 2 days off, play Monday against Maryland, and then on Wednesday play at Illinois. I mean, that's a tough stretch by any measure. I know Illinois isn't expected to be great, but I think Brad Underwood's a really good coach, and you've got just kind of like I said before, going through the meat grinder. So a lot of teams have to do this, but I do think it's interesting that how some teams can have 4 such turnarounds and others can only have 1 seems a little bit odd to me. And I think almost everybody was guaranteed one to a certain extent in those some of those early season matchups, or at least it was close to that, where a lot of people will get those in those December games following the Big Ten ACC Challenge.
Yeah, everybody has one then. So like teams like Purdue and Wisconsin, they don't have another one coming after that, which is crazy. Now there were 4 teams that had a 3-game road stretch. That's Iowa, Northwestern, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. So Indiana did avoid having to go on the road 3 straight games, which is nice. But let's talk about those early December games, because a couple teams made out real nicely. So let's talk about that. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms. We're breaking down the IU basketball schedule, and specifically the Big Ten portion of it in this segment. So Indiana, of course, at Michigan, against Iowa. That seems like a fair twosome to start out. I don't know. I mean, although, we did an interview with Brendan Quinn on Podcast on the Brink, and he thinks Michigan is a top 3 team in the Big Ten, if a couple of their transfers come through. So they're an interesting team, but I think you got a couple of maybe middle of the pack teams there. So that seems fair. Michigan State and Minnesota, obviously Michigan State is the prohibitive favorite in the conference. Minnesota, I think a lot of people think they're the second or third best team in the conference. They play Nebraska and Rutgers for those early games. So not only did they make out really nicely, poor Nebraska and Rutgers. I mean, that's really, I mean, that's kind of rough for them. But you know what? They came, they're a couple of the last teams into the Big Ten. So I don't feel necessarily so bad for them. I just think, the Big Ten clearly seems like they want Michigan State to just run away with this thing, because when Inside the Hall did their analysis of just how the single plays broke down, Michigan State had the easiest schedule there. They clearly got some help here just with the structure of the games. So when Michigan State wins the conference by 2 or 3 games, all I'm saying is don't be surprised. It's a lot like Wisconsin a couple of years ago, where they were by far the best team and had the most favorable schedule. Sometimes it just works out that way.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was interesting. Certainly, conspiracy theorists can, frame that however they want. But it also is an opportunity. Some of these times in early December is when a lot of teams are playing bye games, and to a certain extent, like, this is an opportunity for the conference to really, I guess similar to what they're trying to do by playing more on Mondays and Fridays, really kind of seize opportunities in windows where there typically aren't a lot of games. We can debate whether we think the Friday thing is a good idea or not. But to take 2 of your best teams and not have them play even a reasonably good team during that time is kind of a missed opportunity from my perspective. But certainly Michigan State and Minnesota aren't going to look at it that way. But as for IU's portion of that, I think Michigan might be a team to play better earlier rather than later. That was one of the points I think I made when we talked about this before, was some of these teams that have different pieces that are trying to come in. They've got their point guard coming in as a transfer. They're going to try to work him in. I think he's from Ohio. And so, he'll have had the offseason, but not, a year sitting out. Whereas Charles Matthews from Kentucky was with him last year. So maybe you catch them at a decent time. Still, I think a relatively good team. And Iowa obviously loses Peter Jok, but they have pretty much everybody else back. So it should be a pretty good test for IU early on. So yeah, definitely didn't get any breaks. I mean, not playing both Minnesota and Michigan State or Purdue or somebody like that during that stretch is good, but both should be pretty challenging games. And I think, as you kind of look ahead, if IU came out of that 1-1 in the league, I'd feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, I have to say, when I just kind of looked at the schedule, and saw how many of these quick turnarounds we had and some of the other things, I felt a little bit intimidated. But then when I started going through it, look, if you kind of take it in chunks, right? Those first 2 games, I think 1-1 is a reasonable expectation. Then Indiana plays at Wisconsin and at Minnesota. I don't think Indiana will be favored in any of those games. So, pencil in 0-2 there. Then you come home for Penn State and Northwestern. You would expect to win both of those games. Then you're on the road against Michigan State. You expect to lose that one. Then you have this interesting 6-game stretch where it's the series of one day turnarounds. Maryland, Illinois, then Purdue, Ohio State, then Michigan State, Rutgers. And I think it's reasonable to expect that Indiana can go 5-1 or 4-2 in that stretch, because I think you assume that Indiana can win the home games. Now, maybe Michigan State comes into Assembly Hall and gets a win, but hey, I'm of the mind that this is Simon Scott Assembly Hall. This is the Hoosiers. Let's expect to win the home games. But Illinois, Ohio State, and Rutgers, those are beatable teams on their home floor. So 5-1, 4-2 there doesn't seem unreasonable. And then you come down the stretch, and here's what Indiana has down the stretch: home against Minnesota, home against Illinois, at Iowa, at Nebraska, and home against Ohio State. All seem like very winnable games. Now, it'll, of course, depend on health and how the team's playing and all of that. But, 4-1 or 3-2 at a minimum does not seem unreasonable there. So when you look at that, if you take the optimistic view and you say that they're going to go 5-1 in that tough 6-game stretch and then 4-1 down the stretch, that's 12-6, even with a 1-3 start. Or if you just look at it from a minimum perspective and say they go 4-2 and 3-2 in those final 2 sets of games, you're 10-8 in the conference. And so when you add up, kind of the 8 quote unquote guaranteed wins that you would expect in the non-conference, and that's not to disrespect Arkansas State or Eastern Michigan, because as we said, they're good enough that they could come beat Indiana if Indiana doesn't play. But those 8 games that you would expect to win, then if you can just pick off, 1 or 2 of those tough games, you start to see a very reasonable path to getting to 19, 20, 21 wins at a minimum. That would seem to me would get Indiana into the NCAA tournament, given how good the strength of schedule is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, the strength of schedule is definitely going to help. And the end of the season is, if you take the view that this team is going to grow a great deal over the course of the season in Archie's first year, which I think is absolutely reasonable to expect. I don't think he'll settle for anything less than seeing that progression over the course of the year. By the time the team's hitting its stride, more winnable games. It's funny that not to tie together too much to the Bloom article, but he talked about they were going through and just trying to kind of asking about the conditioning and some of those kinds of things. He goes, you want these athletes to be their best at the right times. In basketball, that's January, February, and March. So if you take kind of the latter piece of that, particularly into the February component, March, may not play games until the NCAA tournament, depending on how the Big Ten tournament goes. But if that really is true, and from a physical standpoint they're playing well, from a system standpoint they're peaking, then I think you have a real chance to build some momentum at the end of the season, heading into that Big Ten tournament, ideally heading into the NCAA tournament, and so that helps. I mean, obviously, we haven't yet to see any of these teams play a game so far, but as you kind of project out where we think teams are going to fall within the league, I do think the end of the season could be exciting. And that's one of the things that we talked about with, so many of the Crean teams, really with the exception of a couple years ago, that didn't peak at the end of the season, that seemed like they were out of gas. And I think this will be a good test, that if everything goes according to plan, based on what Archie has talked about and based on how the schedule lays out, I think you could see the exact opposite.
Yeah, so again, I think it's a really interesting schedule. I think there are reasons to be a little bit perturbed at the Big Ten and what they laid out for Indiana, but I like looking at it the way that you did. I think some of these challenges are actually opportunities. Look, those 3 sets of, one-day turnaround games there in the middle of the season, that's like simulating NCAA tournaments, where you have each weekend, you're going to have a one-day turnaround if you keep winning. So I think there are some opportunities here for Indiana to get signature wins, to really test their mettle and really be a team that has gone through some real battles come February and March. And that, as you said, if they're peaking, if Archie's got his system in, if the guys are buying into it, if young guys are stepping up and if seniors are leading as they're supposed to, if all those things are happening, I think we all think that this team is capable of more maybe than what's going to be expected of them. And I think that the way the schedule lays out really gives them an opportunity to build some momentum there at the end of the season. Anything else schedule-wise that you want to get to before we move on and start talking about some of Archie's interesting comments?
No, I think you hit most of the things that I would say. I think the one thing that it really, these turnarounds will highlight for the team is depth, and I think that's one of the questions that we've had, particularly in the post. As you get into these grinds and going through that, it's really going to be a good test of the depth of the team, and I think going into the season. That's one of the questions we have, and one that I think we'll probably see answered relatively early on, simply because almost out of necessity versus anything else. You're going to have quick turnarounds to play, give guys opportunities and see what happens, and then maybe you settle into more of a rotation by the time the Big Ten season rolls around. But when you really start to think about one of the, what the question marks are for this team, that's certainly one of them, particularly up front, and a question that if you don't find an answer to it pretty quickly, it could end up being a really rough January and February based on the games coming fast and furious, and there's not really a lot of time to catch your breath.
Yep. No question about it. All right, coming up on the Assembly Call, we are going to discuss some interesting comments that Archie Miller made in a recent Bloom magazine article. That is next on the Assembly Call. Stick with us. All right. 15:48 on that one. I guess I should listen, make sure it recorded right. Good. It did record correctly. It's always good.
That definitely helps.
Yeah. Okay. So 15:48. Okay. By the way, good comment there from Mr. Tonsoni. Says, my Indiana State manager son, Brent, wants you guys to give a little love to the Sycamores as a good game. Poor kid loves the Hoosiers, but also loves the Sycamores. They will be better, don't you think, than what their descending RPI or KenPom rating has shown in the last 5 years?
Well, I looked. The only thing I would say is, at least returnee-wise, they have Brenton Scott, who was their leading scorer last year, but they only have one other guy back who scored over 6 points a game. So I don't know what the incoming guys look like that they have coming in. But yeah, I don't know. But Brian would probably be more in a better position to assess how good they might be than there. So they've got a really good guy to kind of test them defensively, and can kind of see how that goes. But
all right, so we're at 32:49. So those first two segments are long, but that's how it should be, because those were the most important topics. And we don't have a ton of great questions, so if we only leave a few minutes at the end, that's okay. So I mean, we can probably go 12, 13 minutes still for this segment.
Yeah, that's fine. I kind of glanced at the questions earlier, but
which one of these should we do first?
In terms of the quotes?
Yeah, in terms of the quotes. The Priller one's interesting. We can, ending with the one about interest outside of basketball, I think is interesting. I'll kick it off with that first one about
the only other stuff that I wrote down was a little bit about the recruiting, where he kind of talked about trying not to spread yourself too thin. That was one of the only other main ones that I saw, but I think we can talk through what you've got and go from there.
Okay. All right, let's do this. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Here we go. By the way, is anybody getting close to bingo? No, IU Artifacts, your question was good. And we're going to get to that. We will definitely answer that question. I kind of wanted more time to research it, though. But all right, let's do
Which one was this?
His question was
former walk-on.
Former walk-on.
Oh man,
I know.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I saw that earlier, and I didn't have time to look things up. So
I know I need to go research it, but I think I've got a good answer as it is.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. You are listening to the Assembly Call. Go to assemblycall.com/join to activate your free membership. You will get our weekly Six Banner Sunday news roundup delivered right to your inbox every Sunday morning, so that you can stay up to date with your Hoosiers during the offseason. And of course, once the season begins, that URL, again, assemblycall.com/join. I am Jared Morris here talking IU basketball with my co-host on the Assembly Call, Andy Bottoms. And Andy, I kind of wanted to get to this last week, and we didn't have time. We actually featured this article in that Six Banner Sunday news roundup. And that is, there's an article in Bloom magazine. You can find it if you go to magbloom.com. It was still the headline article as of today. And it was a feature on new Indiana football coach Tom Allen and new Indiana basketball coach Archie Miller, talking about the new eras. And this is the first time in a long time that both men's basketball and football have had new coaches. And I really thought some of the comments that Archie made were really interesting, and I thought, frankly, some of the questions were really good. So kudos to Bloom Magazine for asking some good questions. But I thought some of Archie's comments were really illuminating. There's a quote that, just in case you were wondering whether Archie Miller is perfect to be the basketball coach at Indiana, this quote will really put it into perspective. And so we're going to end with that. We'll get to that one in just a second. But I thought this exchange was really interesting, and I won't read the whole thing, but Blue Magazine says there's a perception that everyone makes a fortune in college sports except the athletes. Miller, true. Bloom, do you think the athletes ultimately will get paid for what they do? And Archie said probably at some point. I can't speak to when or how much, but I will say this about the way that student athletes' rights are going. Voices are being heard. People are getting smarter about the politics of the business in general. And he says there's got to be some give and take. I do think at some level down the road, there's going to be some format or plan to compensate college athletes because there is a hunger for it. As times change, you have to change with them. I had a lot of thoughts when I read this. One was I wish all coaches in Indiana history had adhered to that philosophy of as times change, you need to change with them, although that is neither here nor there. But, what I really thought is, Archie Miller, to me, comments like this, other comments that he's made, he strikes me as the quintessential players coach. And I know sometimes when we hear the term players coach, we think maybe a guy who's a pushover, the roll the basketballs out type and just let a player do whatever they want to. But to me, I think a players coach is a coach who's always got the players' backs, is on their side. And sometimes that means disciplining and being hard and doing what you have to do to get the best out of that guy. I think it was Tom Izzo who said discipline is the greatest form of love that you can show to another human being, which I think is a great quote. But at the same time, while you're pushing a guy to be their best, you've also got their back. And you want what's best for them, not just on the basketball court because they can win you games, but because you're truly invested in them as an individual. And I think just the view that Archie espoused right there is not only an intelligent view of the way things are going and what the bigger picture of college athletics looks like, but also shows a guy who really seems to me to be truly invested in the betterment, not just of the players as basketball players, but as individuals and looking out for the best for them, which, I love in the basketball coach of Indiana University. What did you take from that comment?
I just thought overall his comments were interesting. He talked about can't really limit a 17 or 18-year-old kid who has an opportunity to go and make millions of dollars, and kind of talking through some of that. But he also was, very much, when they go through those decisions, head coach of the staff brought him along, can seem to be the enemy, just trying to give him information, educate him, help him make the right decision, here to support, to develop, to help him grow, not trying to hold anyone back. I think, those kind of, support what you said. And I think, he made some interesting comments about, it kind of balances both sides of the argument in terms of, these guys do get a great deal in terms of, talking about unbelievable stage, great education. But also said, that there's not a great understanding for people who aren't doing it of everything that goes into the challenge of being a student athlete and kind of the worth that has. So I liked his, just candor in terms of the whole discussion. I think so many times, we hear the coach speak of, I'm saying something that I think people, want me to say, or things that they want to hear. And I think we've kind of seen from him over the course of the last few months, it's not really what he's all about. And I think he just doesn't kind of have time for the charade of putting on that front. And I like it. And I think it comes off as a guy who has a good understanding of all the aspects of the decision. And as you said, as a guy who's, going to support the players and help them in what's in their best interest.
Well, and I love how willing Archie has been, so far, and again, the games haven't started yet, but just in the quotes that we've seen, how willing he has been at every turn to accept responsibility. Immediately when he became the coach, he accepted responsibility for the players that he didn't recruit, but they're his guys. And I think this quote is really telling. He says, when you can get a $250,000 to $300,000 education, you can be set up to do anything you want to do in life as a professional. The thing we have to do, we have to hold ourselves accountable, is to maximize the value of the education. And that's one of the problems too often is, yes, players get this incredible education, but are they really being given the resources to take advantage of it? Or is so much of their focus being spent on basketball, and are they being pushed into classes just to be able to stay eligible that they're not really being challenged? And I think taking on that accountability, and I think Tom Crean really did this, and I think Indiana's academics have come a long way from where they were, obviously, when Tom Crean took over. But I just like Archie's general disposition and his willingness to take responsibility and take accountability for whatever he can do to impact it in a positive way. And I just think that's the kind of mindset that's going to win in the long haul, both off the court and on the court. And it continues to have me encouraged.
Yep, I would totally agree. Let's move to the next one you had, because I think this was a funny one. A guy that you you pined to play more last year.
And he's going to play more this year. It's going to happen. Okay, so the question was, is this the year that Tim Priller gets to play? He hasn't gotten many minutes, but he's a fan favorite. Now, I could just kind of, as I was reading this, I kind of heard in my head Archie kind of laughing a little bit, chuckling to himself as he answered the question. There's a good chance that my man Tim Priller is going to be in there. And this is real telling. Tim's got to see himself a little differently than he did yesterday. He's got to go from being a fan favorite to being coach's favorite. That's the key. That, I think, is a truly insightful statement about what Tim needs to do. Now, I thought when Tim got in last year, we've talked about this, he had very limited playing time. He did a nice job with it. He's going to have to grow and evolve his game even more to get more playing time this year. But that strikes me as a coach who already, with only a few months to get to know these guys, with a guy like Tim Priller, who, last man on the bench, maybe not a guy that you would think a new coach would be spending a whole lot of time in, it feels like he really pinpointed the thing that Tim needs to do. And I think if Tim can do that, he can be a guy who, look, when you're playing, 3 games in 6 days, and Deron Davis is in foul trouble and other guys are tired, you may need someone who's 6'10" to step in and play a few minutes. I think it can really help Indiana if Tim is that guy. And this strikes me as exactly what needs to happen for that to happen.
Well, I just think you hear him talk about, really placing a lot of the accountability on the players. And I think it's a case of, we scoffed last year when you would bring up like playing Priller. And I think his message is like, you can't be that guy anymore. I expect more of you than that. And I think it's a good message to send. One of the other quotes that I wrote down from the article in general, I don't remember which part this was, but he said, with change comes opportunity, and with opportunity comes excitement. I have great faith that we can bring out the best in all of our guys. I mean, if that's right, then Priller has to be a guy that you can turn to in a tight spot and put him in the game and steal some minutes with him. So, I think the expectations that he has and that he's communicated since day one are ones that I think he's really going to hold guys to. I don't see him as a guy who's going to, make excuses for different things going wrong and, guys not being put in a position to succeed. And I think, setting the tone of that by saying, look, you can't, kind of ride by on being the guy that, the human victory cigar when you come in. And as you said, there will absolutely, based on how the schedule lays out, be games when they have to get something out of Tim Priller. Even if that's 5 fouls, they're going to have to get something out of him. And I think it's good to set the tone that that's the expectation.
No question. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms. We are talking about the Bloom Magazine article that featured some really interesting comments from new IU head coach Archie Miller. So here's my favorite one, and you and I were kind of laughing about this in the break. So Bloom asks, what are your interests outside of basketball that you're hoping to take advantage of here? Archie Miller: I don't have a lot of interests outside of basketball. To me, basketball is life. Memo to our friends at HoosierProud.com. Make that a t-shirt. Back to Archie. If I'm not there, I'm usually with my family. That approach got me this far, so I'm going to stick with it. This is a terrific place to raise a family, and I'm hoping we'll be here a long time. I mean, if we needed any more evidence that Archie is the perfect coach for Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, I think we get it with that quote, right?
Yeah, there's no better way to endear yourself to the fans than that quote, like, I don't have a lot of interests outside of basketball. So yeah, that was definitely my favorite of the piece as well. So we both walked away with the same thing there. I love it. I mean, but that's backed up by everything else in the way he's acted really since the opening press conference, that they're just, all business and all basketball, I think, for the most part. So, I think that's what people want, and apparently what he's prepared to deliver.
No question. Also, speaking of deliver, did you see the Archie has a pizza at Mother Bear's now? It's called like the Archie thing. I don't remember all the toppings, but I know there's like pepperoni, there's mushroom on it. I guess that's his favorite pizza that he orders. So nice work by Mother Bear's to get that going already.
Hey, he's already arrived. He's good.
He has. Anything else from that article that stood out to you?
I mean, a lot of the player stuff, we talked about this a little bit, that, there were things that, he said about them that wasn't new. One thing about recruiting, he did say though, and again, not to kind of throw dirt on Crean at this point, but we talked about all the offers and kind of branching out too far. He said, Indiana basketball is a national brand. It can help recruit difference makers from anywhere, but if you're spread too thin, you're going to miss out on guys who can really help you, who are from right here. Again, it's the kind of thing that people love to hear, and I think that we've started to see in action. But I think it just gave a little bit more color, I think, to his overall philosophy from a recruiting perspective. So, short of reiterating things that we've already heard about a lot of the players, other than the fact that nobody has worked harder than Robert Johnson, according to the article, which is, good news for me, obviously.
Nobody. And they need him to talk more. We got to get Robert talking more.
Yeah. Well, we one thing at a time.
One thing at a time. Yes. Okay. So great article. Go to Bloom, or what is it? Magbloom.com. Is that what I said? Yeah. Magbloom.com to read the full article, both about Tom Allen and Archie Miller. Well worth your time. Very, very interesting. All righty. Coming up in our fourth and final segment, we do have some Twitter questions. And so we are going to get to those, plus a super quick recruiting update, because there's not a whole lot to talk about, but one thing that is worthy of note. That's coming up on the Assembly Call. All right, that was 12:01. It's a nice tight segment. Let me see here. Brian said, read Brad Bennett comment. It's really good. So a tough non-conference is good going into the Big Ten, but is also overlooked to the benefit it has building year-over-year experience playing tough teams regularly for younger guys. That is true.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
I mean, think about how many times we referenced that, that NC State game from the 1 year and like the dividends that paid. I think Jordan Holtz even talked about that either on
because the Kentucky win would not have happened. We would not have beaten Kentucky without that win.
Yeah. So definitely true. You definitely see that going forward. So
maybe the Seton Hall win is going to be Archie Miller's NC State, and we can just continue making parallels.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we are at 44:50. Which is good. So we need to start at, leave 36 seconds for the outro. How much time does that give us?
How much?
Are you good at math in your head?
I can be, but I wasn't listening to what you said. So in this case,
we're at 44:50.
You're gonna need to reiterate that. All right, so that means we have 5 minutes and 10 seconds left.
Yes.
So that
need
and then
4
minus,
minutes,
30 something.
4 minutes at 4:34. We have to start the outro. Okay. 4:34.
All right.
It's always the hardest part of these shows.
I know the math. The math gets you every time.
I know.
Surprisingly, surprisingly, time math was not something that we covered when I majored in math at IU. So
okay, so
curriculum.
I'm gonna do super quick. Just talk about the only recruiting thing is like Robert Finney. All the chatter continues to be relatively positive for Indiana. So that's about all there is to say about recruiting. And then we can hit some of these questions quick, and then maybe we'll end with the walk-on question.
Yeah, I've been feverishly trying to like run through historical stats to see if I can find who I think the right answer would be. This is one of those where I feel like there's a relatively obvious answer that we should know about, but I'm totally missing it. So I'm trying to get back a little bit further in the archives to see if it comes to me, but I have yet to find what I think the answer would be.
Hey, I've got a guy who hit 2 big threes in a Big Ten road game and contributed.
You're not,
to a Big Ten
you're not wrong. It's not a terrible choice. So,
okay, so let's we'll get through these pretty quick. Okay, 4:34. Ready?
Sure.
Okay, here we go. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I am Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms talking IU basketball, wrapping up another week of talking IU basketball on the Assembly Call. So I teased a quick recruiting update. There's just, not a whole lot of new recruiting news this week. All I will say is the chatter that I continue to hear about Robert Finney is good. It's positive. It doesn't mean that, a decision is coming like tomorrow or anything, or that it's a slam dunk, but it does sound like, Indiana's in a good position. It sounds like Ohio State might be in a decent position too. And so we await his decision, but he would obviously be a great get for Indiana and Archie Miller, another 4-star kid, another guy from Indiana. So we will see what he decides. Andy, let's go through some of these questions. We can go kind of quickly. While you consider Kyle's question of Seton Hall, Duke, Louisville, and Notre Dame, the over-under on wins, Nate asked, was Bobby Hurley's cameo in an IU jersey and blue chips to blame for his lackluster pro career? I will answer that with no. His unfortunate car accident and lack of athletic ability probably played more into it than the blue chips cameo. Dang it. You know what? I just realized he was just trying to get us to do a blue chips reference for bingo. Smart. The game theory that is happening because of Assembly Call bingo. Nate, Hat tip to you. I hope you got a bingo card with blue chips on there. Okay.
We've got smart listeners. We've always known how smart and in tune the audience was. This is just further proof that they're now
clearly smarter than the hosts. Clearly smarter than the hosts. Okay. How many wins do you think Indiana gets in their 4 extra tough non-conference games?
Oh boy. So over under. I mean, I think they win it. I think they win at least one. I mean, you said they already had one, so I'll take the somewhat optimistic view and say too that they'll find a way to split.
So you think probably the more likely one would be beating either Seton Hall or Notre Dame, in addition to Duke, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think Notre Dame. I mean, Notre Dame has Bonzie Colson back, but I think they've got some other questions on their roster. They don't have a lot of other guys back, so that's one where I think you could have some roster turnover, some early season struggles there.
Yep. So Adam says, God forbid if we're faced with injury problems, specifically in the post, do we play Race? That's Race Thompson, who arrived on campus earlier this week. I know Archie will do what's in the best interest of the player. Adam, I think you answered the question right there. I think Archie will do what's in the best interest of the player. I think there is a plan in place with Race already. I mean, he's coming to campus early, so maybe they have a contingency that if something happens, he would burn that year, but I doubt it. I think he's pretty well set to sit out the year, but obviously we'll have to see. But I agree with you that he'll do what's in the best interest of the player.
I mean, I would argue on that. If things get to that point, there's no reason to burn it. I mean, things would probably be going poorly, so why waste the year when you're probably not going to get that much out of it?
I agree. Our final question from our buddy Chris, IU Artifacts, who, by the way, we're going to have on an upcoming episode, which is going to be a lot of fun, and we'll go through some of those IU artifacts. If a former IU walk-on had to take the last shot for the win, who would take it? Now, this is a hard question, and Andy, as you and I both talked about off air, there's probably a really obvious answer. We need some time to dig into this, but we didn't have it. I went with Ryan Burton, and I went with Ryan Burton because still fresh in my mind is that 2016 game at Rutgers when he and Max Bielfeldt, and to a certain extent OG Anunoby, absolutely saved Indiana's bacon when Yogi and Troy were turning it over left and right. It looked like Rutgers was going to have a chance to win that game. Burton hit 2 big 3-pointers. He was 2 for 2, had 6 points that really helped Indiana keep Rutgers at bay. And, I mean, you start out the Big Ten season with a loss at Rutgers with how, the rest of that season had already been going. That would have been a huge loss. Instead, they won. They kept the momentum going from the Notre Dame victory, and obviously we know what happened the rest of that season. So it was a huge win, huge shots. So if I had to do it, I'm going with Ryan Burton because he's the guy most recently that I've seen from a walk-on position hit big shots. We've got about 20 seconds left, Andy. Who are you taking?
I'm gonna take Luke Jimenez, who lived down the hall from me at Briscoe. My freshman year was AJ Guyton's roommate. So I'll go with that.
Poor man's Bronson Koenig.
Yeah, absolutely. So and Chuck Crab always said his name really, Luke Jimenez. So I think that's good. I'll go with him.
Chuck Crab. We just need to get a CD of Chuck Crab saying IU players' names. I would get that and listen to it nightly, probably.
As would anyone listening to this.
All right. Well, that will do it for us on this week's episode of the Assembly Call. If you want to see us do the show live and be part of the live chat, join us at assemblycall.com on Thursday nights for the live simulcast of our Assembly Call radio recording. Or you can always subscribe to our podcast by searching for Assembly Call wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to go to assemblycall.com/join to activate your free Assembly Call membership. Thank you for listening. We will be back to talk IU hoops again with you next week. Until then, keep your elbows in and your eyes on the rim. And go Hoosiers. Very nice.
The other guys I found as I was going through stats, like Eric Sewer was one. He had games at times where he was, could make some shots. And then I forget whether it was Ryan Tapak or Mark Johnson, the one year that played really well in the Big Ten tournament. I cannot remember which one of them that was. Like they all of a sudden
I think it was Tapak, wasn't it?
I think it was too. That's who I'm tempted to say, but they both ended up playing a lot in that Big Ten tournament for reasons that I'm not sure we quite understand. But those were the other ones that I thought of, but I didn't have time to rattle them all off.
IU Artifact said Antoine Randall. That would have been.
I did think of that. I did think of some of the former football players that were there, but Antoine, when he played, had a broken hand or wrist, so I'm not sure how.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fact that he didn't chime in with an obvious answer that we were idiots and missed, I feel better about, even though I still feel like there is a somewhat obvious answer that we missed.
Like the Jay Edwards was a walk-on or something, and we just forgot about it.
Yeah.
He also says, I love when Chuck says Iowa. If you've ever heard Jake Query in Indianapolis does a great Chuck Crab impression. I've been listening to their podcast lately. You were you the one that told me about that when they did their IU Legend series and they've got
no.
If you go subscribe to their podcast, Query and Schultz, and just look in the archives, he's got all these interviews, like ones with Greg Graham.
There it is. If anybody, if anybody's still playing, trying to get
hanging around.
Trying to get
he's got a bunch of them. The one with Rick Calloway is really good. The Marco Killingsworth one is incredible. It's really good. It is good. Shock no one said Kevin Lemmy or John Paul. Yeah. Oh man.
Nice.
Blast from the past.
Yeah. I kind of scrolled through the stats. There certainly were, like, Danny Moore was another one that
Danny Moore
as I went through, but yeah, in terms of like shooters, depending upon like the scenario, I don't know that there are a lot of the guys that we mentioned that were terrific shooters, but Jimenez has played quite a bit while he was there.
Yeah, Jimenez. Yeah, I like Jimenez. That's a good answer. That is a good answer. All right. So I don't know. So we're going to do an episode with IU Artifacts. I don't know when that'll be. We got to figure out the scheduling. Are you going to be here next week?
I think so. Yeah, I should be fine.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember. Next week is when Jen goes back to school, but the kids don't. So I think I'm good.
Okay. All right,
I'm very confused. There are a lot of things going on in the next couple of weeks that I figured out that I have to keep track of. So,
and by the way, I do try the day of, now that we have Assembly Call Bingo, to say who's on the show and who's not. So follow the Twitter account at Assembly Call. But I like the 10-minute rule. I'm good with that.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know how we'd police it anyway, but if we're all in the honor system,
also,
yeah, I'm
I
good
mean, for
with
a
that.
shirt, I can assume that we're all willing to, play with great integrity. So.
Now that
not like Ryan in the weight loss challenge, who's like apparently guzzled, a gallon of water before he weighed himself last week. But
the honor system is interesting. I kind of feel like Big Ten teams should just officiate their own games on the honor system, and it might actually be better.
Could not be worse than some of the guys that are out there.
Like, how honest would Ethan Hatt be? Would he just be like calling himself for travels?
I mean, maybe. I don't think we can rule that out.
I'm just trying to see how many bingo things I can get in at the very end.
I mean, Bo Borowski sure as hell isn't going to call him for it, so you might as well. You might as well just ride it out and see if he does it on his own.
All right, everybody. We will see you next week. Thanks for being here live. It's always great having you.